a relentless snowstorm, a desperate mother dog, and a decision that changes everything. What would you do in the face of such a moment? This heart-stirring story of a German Shepherd and her pups will challenge your notions of trust, compassion, and courage. What happens next will leave you speechless. A snowstorm howled across the wilderness, blanketing the world in an impenetrable veil of white. Jack leaned against the windowsill of his remote cabin, watching the wind whip snow into furious spirals. The wood stove crackled in the corner, filling the room with warmth, but his heart remained cold, weighed down by memories he couldn't escape. The solitude he had sought in these woods was supposed to be a refuge, but it had become more like a sentence. He turned away from the window and poked at the embers in the stove, adding another log to the fire. Outside, the storm screamed louder, the wind rattling the windows as if it wanted in. Jack was used to the sound. The storms were frequent this time of year, and his cabin was solid, built to endure. Still, something felt different. Amid the cacophony of the storm, a faint, intermittent cry reached his ears. Jack paused, the poker hovering above the embers. At first, he thought he had imagined it, a trick of the wind. But there it was again, faint but distinct, a sound of desperation. He stood motionless, heart thudding as the cries grew louder. They were coming from just outside the cabin. For a long moment he hesitated. In these woods it could be anything. A wounded animal, perhaps, or something more dangerous. Jack grabbed a flashlight and heavy coat, steeling himself before stepping into the storm. The icy wind tore at him immediately, cutting through his layers and stinging his skin. He followed the sound, trudging through the snow that reached his calves. The beam of his flashlight scanned the porch and the nearby trees, and then he saw them. Huddled against the side of the cabin was a German Shepherd. Her body curved protectively around two tiny puppies. The mother's coat was matted with snow and ice, her ribs visible even through the thick fur. The puppies, barely more than bundles of fur themselves, trembled against her, their whimpers barely audible over the storm. Jack's first instinct was to turn away. He didn't need this. He had come here to escape, to shut out the world and its endless demands. Yet, as his flashlight illuminated the mother's eyes, he saw something that froze him in place. Sheer desperation. Her gaze met his, pleading without words, as though she knew he was her only hope. He hesitated, the wind howling around him. "I can't," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to himself or the dog. His life had no room for more responsibility, for more pain. But the sight of the puppies, shivering and frail, shifted something inside him. They wouldn't survive the night out here. He couldn't just walk away. Swearing under his breath, Jack knelt in the snow. "Come on," he said, his voice rough but steady. The mother didn't move at first, her body still shielding the pups. Slowly, Jack reached out a hand, careful not to startle her. She sniffed at him cautiously, her trembling muzzle brushing his glove. After a moment, she allowed him to pick up the first puppy, and then the second. Each was no heavier than a sack of flour, their tiny bodies limp with exhaustion. The mother followed as Jack carried them toward the cabin, her steps unsteady but determined. Inside, Jack placed the puppies on an old blanket near the stove and turned to the mother. She stood by the door, her body still tense with weariness. "It's okay," he murmured, kneeling and gesturing for her to come closer. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her. The warmth hit her instantly, and she sank to the floor beside her pups, curling around them protectively. Jack watched as they settled into the blanket, their small bodies finally relaxing in the heat. He exhaled slowly, realizing his hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of the choice he'd just made. Jack sat in the dim light of the cabin, his gaze fixed on the small family huddled near the wood stove. The mother dog, whom he had decided to call Grace, lay curled protectively around her two puppies, their tiny bodies pressed close against her warmth. Every now and then, one of the pups let out a small squeak, shifting slightly before settling back into a peaceful slumber. Grace's eyes remained open, her head resting on her paws, but her gaze was fixed on Jack, wary and untrusting. He tried to keep his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to startle her. Her ribs were still visible beneath her thick fur, and her ears twitched at the smallest noise, as though ready to leap to her feet at any moment. Jack knew that look all too well. He had seen it in the eyes of people he'd rescued from burning buildings, people who had been trapped, scared, and unsure of what would happen next. He couldn't help but wonder what Grace had endured before showing up at his cabin. Leaning back in his chair, Jack allowed his thoughts to wander. He hadn't chosen this isolated life on a whim. Years ago, he had been a firefighter in the city, driven by a need to help others and make a difference. But one day, a rescue mission had gone horribly wrong. He had been unable to save a young girl trapped in a blaze, and the weight of that failure had driven him into the wilderness, far from the noise and judgment of the world. Out here, he could face his demons alone, or so he had thought. Yet, even in this quiet isolation, the memories haunted him. Grace shifted slightly, drawing Jack's attention back to the present. He watched as she nudged one of the puppies closer to her, licking its tiny face with gentle care. Despite her exhaustion, her maternal instinct was undeniable. Jack felt a pang of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Purpose. He wasn't sure why, but the sight of Grace and her pups stirred something deep within him, a small ember of the man he used to be. He decided to approach her again, moving slowly and lowering himself to the floor a few feet away. "Hey, girl," he murmured softly, his voice calm and soothing. Grace's ears perked up, and her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't growl or back away. Jack held out his hand, palm up, allowing her to make the next move. After a long moment, Grace sniffed the air cautiously before lowering her head again. It wasn't much, but it was progress. Over the next hour, Jack busied himself preparing food and water for the dogs. He found an old metal bowl in the cupboard and filled it with lukewarm water, setting it down near Grace. She eyed it suspiciously at first, but eventually stretched her neck forward and began to drink. Her movements were cautious, but Jack noticed a hint of relief in the way her body relaxed slightly as she drank. Encouraged, he tried offering her some pieces of cooked meat from his own dinner. She sniffed the food before accepting it, chewing slowly as though testing its safety. For the first time, Jack saw the faintest flicker of trust in her eyes. As the hours passed, the storm outside continued to rage, but inside, a fragile peace had settled. The puppies stirred occasionally, letting out small whimpers, and Grace would immediately tend to them, her focus unwavering. Jack found himself admiring her strength, her determination to care for her young despite whatever hardships she had faced. It reminded him of his own struggles, of how he had tried to protect others even when it had cost him so much. That night, as he sat in his chair and watched the fire burn low, Jack felt something he hadn't felt in years. A glimmer of hope. Grace had taken the first step toward trusting him, and he realized that in caring for her and her pups, he might find a way to heal himself. As sleep began to overtake him, the sound of the storm outside faded into the background, replaced by the steady, rhythmic breathing of Grace and her puppies. The morning broke with a pale, muted light filtering through the frost-covered windows. Outside, the storm had finally relented, leaving the world buried beneath a thick, unbroken blanket of snow. Jack rose from his chair, his muscles stiff from the night spent by the fire. His eyes drifted to Grace and her puppies, still nestled in the warm cocoon of blankets near the wood stove. Grace stirred as he moved, her ears perking up and her amber eyes following him with cautious curiosity. The puppies, however, remained asleep, their small bodies rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Jack busied himself with breakfast, his movements methodical and deliberate. He prepared something simple for himself, then set aside a portion of scrambled eggs for Grace. Her gaunt frame still troubled him. She clearly hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. Placing the food near her, he stepped back to give her space. She hesitated, sniffing the air before tentatively taking a bite. Jack couldn't help but feel a small swell of satisfaction as she ate, her trust in him growing little by little. After breakfast, Jack knew it was time to take the next step. The puppies seemed healthier than the day before, but their tiny frames and Grace's fragile condition made him uneasy. He didn't know much about dogs, but he knew they needed medical attention. The nearest veterinary clinic was nearly an hour's drive away, and with the snow covering the road, it would be a difficult journey. Still, he couldn't put it off any longer. Gathering his winter gear, Jack prepared to head out. Grace watched him with suspicion as he approached the blanket. "It's okay, girl," he said softly, crouching down to her level. He held out his hand, letting her sniff it before gently picking up the first puppy. Grace tensed, her muscles coiled as though ready to spring, but she didn't interfere. She simply watched, her gaze flicking between Jack and her pups as he placed them carefully into a makeshift carrier he'd lined with towels for warmth. When it came time for Grace to follow, she resisted, planting her paws firmly on the floor. Jack crouched again, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not leaving you behind. You and your babies need help." He extended his hand, and after a tense pause, Grace relented, stepping hesitantly into the carrier he had prepared for her. The drive to the clinic was as treacherous as Jack had expected. Snow had piled high on the winding roads, and ice clung to the edges of the asphalt. He gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes scanning for any obstacles as the truck trudged forward. The puppies whimpered occasionally from their carrier, and Jack spoke softly to them, his voice steady and reassuring. Grace remained quiet, her body pressed against the side of the carrier, her eyes fixed on her pups. When they finally arrived, Jack was greeted by the warmth and sterility of the clinic. The veterinarian, a kind woman with a gentle demeanor, ushered them inside immediately. She examined Grace first, her experienced hands moving carefully over the dog's body. "She's malnourished and dehydrated," the vet said, her tone sympathetic. "But she's strong. It's clear she's been through a lot." The vet then turned her attention to the puppies, checking their tiny hearts and lungs, their paws and eyes. "They're small for their age, likely due to poor nutrition, but I think they'll be okay with proper care." She paused, scanning Grace for a microchip. When the scanner beeped, Jack's stomach tightened. A number appeared on the screen, and the vet's face grew serious. "She was registered to someone, but I'll have to check if she's still listed as owned or if there's any record of her being surrendered or lost." Jack felt a pang of dread. He didn't want to imagine Grace being taken back to a life of suffering. "What happens if someone claims her?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. The vet looked at him with a reassuring smile. "For now, she's with you. We'll cross that bridge if it comes, but I doubt anyone who let her get into this condition will bother to come forward." Relief washed over Jack as he loaded Grace and her puppies back into the truck for the drive home. The vet had provided medication for Grace, special food for all of them, and a list of instructions for their care. Jack felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through him as he glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Grace's watchful eyes. For the first time in years, he felt as though he was doing something that mattered, not just for himself, but for these 3 fragile lives that now depended on him. The days passed peacefully after their visit to the vet. Jack dedicated himself to caring for Grace and her puppies, following every instruction the vet had given him. Grace grew stronger with each meal, her coat gaining a healthier shine, and her once guarded demeanor softening. The puppies, who Jack had started calling Max and Luna, became more energetic, exploring the small cabin with their unsteady legs and clumsy curiosity. For the first time in years, the cabin felt alive, filled with the warmth of life and the soft sounds of paws patting on the wooden floor. Jack found himself talking to Grace as he worked around the cabin, his voice breaking the silence that had once been his only companion. Grace would listen attentively, her amber eyes following his every move, as if she understood more than he expected. He told her about his life before the cabin, about the firehouse, and the day he lost everything that mattered. She never looked away, her quiet presence a strange but comforting reminder that someone, or something, was listening. But the peace didn't last. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the snow-covered trees, Jack noticed a dark shape approaching the cabin. His heart sank as the figure came closer, the sound of boots crunching in the snow cutting through the otherwise tranquil air. A man in a heavy coat stopped at the edge of the porch, his face obscured by a hood. Jack stepped outside, his body tense, and the man immediately addressed him. "That's my dog," the stranger said, his voice sharp and confrontational. His gloved hand pointed to the window where Grace and her puppies were visible. Grace had noticed the man too. She stood frozen, her body trembling, her ears pinned back in fear. Jack's stomach churned. "I don't know who you are, but she's not your dog anymore," he replied, his voice calm but firm. The man pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket and held it out. It was a certificate of ownership, bearing Grace's description and the man's name. "She's mine," the man insisted, stepping closer. "And I want her back." Jack glanced back at the window, where Grace had taken a protective stance over her puppies. Her body language told him everything he needed to know. This man wasn't just a stranger. He was the source of Grace's scars, the reason she had run away, carrying her puppies through the storm. "She's not going anywhere," Jack said, stepping in front of the door. The man scowled, his posture shifting aggressively. "You have no right to keep her," he snapped. "I'll call the authorities." Jack didn't flinch. "Go ahead," he replied evenly. "But you should know the vet already filed a report about her condition. If you were her owner, you're the one who's got explaining to do." The man hesitated, his confidence faltering. He muttered something under his breath and took a step back. "This isn't over," he warned, his voice laced with venom. Turning sharply, he trudged back into the snow, leaving Jack standing on the porch, his heart pounding. Inside, Grace hadn't moved from her spot. Her wide eyes were fixed on Jack, her body trembling slightly. Jack crouched down beside her, placing a hand gently on her head. "He's not going to hurt you," he said softly. "Not while I'm here." Grace leaned into his touch, a quiet whimper escaping her lips, as though she finally understood that she wasn't alone anymore. That evening, Jack made a call to the local authorities and the vet, explaining what had happened. He secured the cabin's locks and placed a sturdy piece of wood across the front door. His mind raced with contingency plans as he checked on Grace and the pups, who had finally settled down after the encounter. As the night deepened, Jack sat near the fire, his senses alert, knowing that the man's threat was far from idle. He wasn't just protecting Grace and her puppies now. He was protecting the family they had become. The night was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the wood stove. Jack sat in his chair, eyes scanning the dimly lit room while Grace and her puppies rested near the fire. The day's tension still hung heavy in the air, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man's parting words echoed in his mind, sharp and threatening. Jack had fortified the cabin as best he could, but the unease lingered. He glanced at the shotgun propped against the wall, hoping he wouldn't have to use it but comforted by its presence. Sometime after midnight, the faint crunch of snow outside reached his ears. His body tensed instantly, every muscle alert. He rose quietly, grabbing the shotgun and moving toward the window. The moonlight reflected off the snow, casting an eerie glow, and Jack's heart sank when he spotted a shadow moving near the edge of the trees. Whoever it was, they were trying to stay hidden, their movements deliberate and slow. Jack cursed under his breath, his worst fears realized. Grace must have sensed it too. She lifted her head, her ears swiveling, and a low growl rumbled from her throat. Jack held up a hand, signaling her to stay quiet. He didn't want whoever was outside to know he was watching. He moved to the door, peering through the small window. The shadow moved closer, and he could just make out the figure of the man from earlier, a crowbar glinting faintly in his hand. Jack's mind raced. He needed to act fast, but he also needed to be smart. Bursting out of the cabin would give the man the advantage, but waiting too long could mean letting him get inside. He carefully slid the shotgun into his hands and unlatched the window. From his position, he had a clear line of sight to the man, who was now approaching the porch. "Don't take another step," Jack called out, his voice firm and steady. The man froze, his head snapping up to look at Jack. "You've got no business here," Jack continued, his grip on the shotgun tightening. "Turn around and leave before you regret it." The man laughed, a low, mocking sound that made Jack's skin crawl. "You think you can scare me with that?" he said, taking another step forward. "That dog is mine, and I'm taking her." Jack felt his anger flare but kept his composure. "She doesn't belong to you anymore," he said. "And if you try to break in, you won't make it past the door." The man's expression darkened, and he gripped the crowbar tighter. "You don't scare me, old man," he spat, lunging toward the door. But before he could reach it, a feral growl tore through the night. Grace, who had been silent until now, charged toward the door, her teeth bared and her hackles raised. The man stumbled back, startled by the sudden aggression. Jack seized the moment. He stepped onto the porch, the shotgun aimed directly at the man. "You have two choices," he said coldly. "Leave now and never come back, or wait here for the cops. Your call." For a moment, the man hesitated, weighing his options. The sight of Grace, now standing protectively in front of her puppies, seemed to unnerve him. Finally, he muttered a string of curses and backed away, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Jack didn't lower the shotgun until the man was completely out of sight. He closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. Grace stood by his side, her body still tense but her eyes watching him closely. "Good girl," Jack whispered, his voice soft but full of emotion. Grace nudged his hand with her nose, her silent acknowledgement of the partnership they had just formed. The rest of the night passed without further incident, but Jack didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, keeping watch as Grace and her puppies finally settled down. In his mind, he replayed the events of the night, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He realized that Grace wasn't just a dog he was protecting. She was his ally, his partner, and his family. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Jack knew they would face them together. Morning arrived quietly, the pale light of dawn creeping through the cabin's frost-covered windows. Jack rubbed his tired eyes, his body aching from the restless night. Grace was lying near the fire, her puppies nestled close to her side. Their soft breaths created a rhythm that felt calming amidst the tension that had gripped him since the previous night. Jack stood and stretched, moving carefully so as not to disturb them. The cabin was still, but he knew the battle was far from over. He stepped outside to check the perimeter. The snow crunched under his boots, and the cold air bit at his face. His eyes scanned the edge of the woods, half expecting the man to return, but there was no sign of movement. The tracks from the previous night were already beginning to fade under the fresh snowfall, but Jack's resolve had only strengthened. He had no intention of letting Grace and her puppies face danger again. Back inside, Grace watched him as he prepared breakfast, her amber eyes filled with a quiet trust that hadn't been there before. Jack set a bowl of food down for her and poured himself a cup of coffee, his mind already racing through plans for the day. He needed to contact the authorities again, to ensure they were taking the man's threat seriously. He also needed supplies to further secure the cabin. Grace seemed to sense his focus, her gaze steady as she nuzzled one of the puppies, encouraging it to eat. After breakfast, Jack made a series of calls. The local sheriff assured him that the matter was being looked into, though Jack detected a lack of urgency in the officer's tone. Frustrated but determined, he called the veterinarian, who reiterated her support and promise to help document Grace's condition further if needed. The sense of isolation was heavy, but Jack reminded himself that he wasn't truly alone anymore. Grace and her pups needed him, and that gave him purpose. By mid-morning, Jack began reinforcing the cabin. He added extra locks to the doors and boarded up the larger windows, leaving just enough space to let light in. Grace stayed close by, watching his every move. The puppies, unaware of the tension, played clumsily around her feet, their small tails wagging with newfound energy. Jack couldn't help but smile at their innocence, a stark contrast to the dangers lurking just beyond the cabin walls. As the day wore on, Jack noticed small changes in Grace. She moved with more confidence now, her head held higher and her posture less guarded. Her trust in him was growing stronger, and in return, Jack felt an unspoken bond forming. A partnership built on survival, trust, and something deeper that neither of them could name. For the first time in years, Jack didn't feel like he was merely existing. He felt alive, driven by the need to protect this makeshift family. Evening settled in, the sky turning shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. Jack lit the wood stove, the warmth spreading through the cabin as he sat down to write in his journal, something he hadn't done in years. His pen moved across the page, capturing not just the events of the past days, but the emotions that had surfaced. Hope, fear, determination. Grace lay at his feet, her head resting on her paws, while the puppies dozed nearby, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath. As the fire crackled, Jack found himself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. Grace had arrived at his door as a desperate, frightened creature, but now she was a symbol of resilience and strength. In caring for her and her puppies, Jack had rediscovered parts of himself he thought were long lost. The courage to fight, the ability to trust, and the capacity to love. That night, the cabin felt different. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a home. Jack sat by the fire, his hand resting on Grace's head as she slept. The puppies stirred occasionally, their soft whimpers fading into the quiet hum of the night. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside, there was warmth, safety, and a sense of belonging that Jack hadn't felt in years. He knew there were challenges ahead, but for the first time he felt ready to face them. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Jack, Grace, Max, and Luna. Together, they were a family. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us, and we hope you enjoyed this heartfelt story as much as we loved sharing it with you. If you found the video inspiring or moving, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps us reach more people who might need a little extra light in their day. And if you'd like to join us for more amazing stories, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss a new upload. We're excited to bring you even more unforgettable tales that inspire, connect, and leave a lasting impression. Until next time, take care, and we can't wait to see you again in our next story.